In this next example, we can observe that the relative clause is being introduced by the word which. That means that the antecedent for the relative clause is not going to be a person. It's going to be a thing, an animal, or a concept, but not a person, right? So we also know that the relative clause should be placed right next to the word that it modifies. In this case, it's stickers, right? The door to the patio has many stickers, which Jenny put there. As you can see, in this case, the pronoun which is acting not as the subject of the clause, because the subject of the clause is Jenny. So, based on this, I know this is an object relative pronoun. Next example reads, the pet which protected the child was a beloved dog. Now see, again, I am using which because its antecedent is not a person. In this case, it's an animal, right? What protected the child? The pet, right? So as you can see, that sentence, that clause could read, the pet protected the child. Now I can use which because I can use which for animals, concepts, or things, but I can also use that, like in the next sentence. It's basically the same sentence, but instead of using which, we're using that. But this only applies for essential relative clauses. We cannot do that in non-essential. We will study about non-essential clauses in some moments. Let's see now some examples using the relative pronoun whose. I've met many professionals whose ego spoils them. Now, remember that whose can be used for people, right? But it can also be used for things, for concepts, for animals. We know the antecedent for whose is professionals. Now, remember too that whose is going to keep some sort of genitive relation. So we need to use the genitive of professionals in order to make sense of this clause. So it's like if it would say professionals apostrophe, right? Many professionals apostrophe ego spoils them. So it is showing the possession of the ego, but whose is not the subject. Whose is always going to be classified as an object relative pronoun because the actual subject of this clause, and I repeat, I insist, when I talk about the subject or object, I am referring only to the clause, not to the whole sentence. But anyway, the subject of the clause is ego. Whose is actually acting as a genitive for ego. Let's check out the next example. The printer whose ink ran out is on Elisa's desk. Now we are using as antecedent an inanimate object, right? So again, we are using whose, which implies that we are going to use the antecedent but in the genitive function. So that would say the printer's ink ran out, right? We are using the genitive form for the antecedent. Again, whose is not acting as the subject. We are going to classify this pronoun as an object relative pronoun. One more example. That is Jairo, whose parents do not love him. Now, here we're using a person again, and the antecedent is Jairo. The antecedent for whose is Jairo, but because whose exhibits a function of genitive, we are going to use the antecedent in the genitive form. Jairo's parents do not love him, right? That's what it says. Again, this relative pronoun is going to be classified as an object relative pronoun, not as a subject relative pronoun. Let's talk now about the relative adverbs and their antecedents. As you know, the relative adverbs are where, when, and why. Any of the relative adverbs, that is when, where, or why, when they are introducing a relative clause, they always perform the same role. They are always going to be adverbials. Remember, this role is the role in the clause. I insist once again, when I talk about the role of these relative pronouns and relative adverbs, the role is in the clause, not in the whole sentence. Now, the antecedent of a relative adverb must be a noun or a noun equivalent that shows a relation with the kind of relative adverb we are using. For example, if we are using the relative adverb when, the antecedent is going to be a word that shows time. If I am using the relative adverb where, the antecedent is going to be a word that shows place. And if I am using the relative adverb why, the antecedent is going to be a word that shows motive. Let's see some cases where we are using relative clauses introduced by relative adverbs. They found the house where the money was hidden. The antecedent for the relative clause introduced by where has to be a word that shows place, in this case house. Claudia remembered the day when she started her job at Mickey's. The antecedent for this relative clause, because it's being introduced by when, has to be a word that shows time, in this case day. In the last example, I can see the reason why you thought she liked you. The antecedent for the clause has to be a word that shows motive. In this case, it's the word reason. Check out that in all of these cases, the relative adverb, either where, when, or why, is never going to be the subject of the clause. So this relative adverb is going to be classified as an object relative pronoun. It is very important that you always look for the antecedent, because especially with relative clauses that are introduced by when, where, and why, it is very, very easy to classify or to confuse clauses that are not relative clauses. Okay, I'm gonna show you some examples now. I want to know where I can buy some inexpensive shorts. Now, if we look at this clause, where I can buy some inexpensive shorts, if we are not careful, we are going to say, oh, that's a relative clause. But no, that's not a relative clause. Remember that the relative clause needs to be introduced by an antecedent, and in this case we are using where. So the antecedent of the relative clause has to be a word that shows location, right? What place are we talking about in the sentence? No place, right? That is actually not a relative clause, that is a noun clause to be precise. I want to know what, where I can buy some inexpensive shorts. So the function of this clause is a noun clause, and it's acting as the object of the infinitive to know. Mariela used to spend time near the well with her granny when she visited her in her ranch. Again, that is not really a relative clause. What is the antecedent for the relative clause? Granny. No, sorry, granny is not a place. Granny is a person, right? So that is not really a relative clause. That is actually adverb clause of time. We are going to study adverb clauses next, okay? That's our next topic of study. And in the last example, you can check that we are using the word why. So that means that the antecedent for why should be a cause, a motive. The second sister has always known why you are here, Cal. What is the antecedent of why? We don't have a word that shows motive. So this is not really a relative clause. We do not have an antecedent. That is actually a noun clause. The second sister has always known what? Why you are here, Cal. That is actually a noun clause acting as the direct object. So please always remember to check the antecedent of the clause. And this doesn't only apply to relative clauses introduced by the relative adverbs. It applies for any clause that you consider might be a relative clause. You always will find an antecedent. Because remember what I mentioned some time ago in this presentation, all relative clauses are introduced by a relative pronoun. And relative pronouns are one of those few pronouns that always require an antecedent.